Sovereignty is understood in jurisprudence as the full right and power of a governing body to govern itself without any interference from outside sources or bodies. In political theory, sovereignty is a substantive term designating supreme authority over some polity. It is a basic principle underlying the dominant Westphalian model of state foundation, derived from Latin through French souveraineté. Its attainment and retention, in both Chinese and Western culture, has traditionally been associated with certain moral imperatives upon any claimant. Different approaches. The concept of sovereignty has been discussed throughout history, from the time before recorded history through to the present day. It has changed in its definition, concept, and application throughout, especially during the Age of Enlightenment. The current notion of state sovereignty contains four aspects consisting of territory, population, authority and recognition. According to Stephen D. Krasner, the term could also be understood in four different ways. Domestic sovereignty, actual control over a state exercised by an authority organized within this state. Interdependent sovereignty, actual control of movement across states' borders, assuming the borders exist. International legal sovereignty, formal recognition by other sovereign states. Westphalian sovereignty, lack of other authority over state than the domestic authority. Often, these four aspects all appear together, but this is not necessarily the case. They are not affected by one another, and there are historical examples of states that were non-sovereign in one aspect while at the same time being sovereign in another of these aspects. According to Emanuel Wallerstein, another fundamental feature of sovereignty is that it is a claim that must be recognized by others if it is to have any meaning. Sovereignty is more than anything else a matter of legitimacy that requires reciprocal recognition. Sovereignty is a hypothetical trade, in which two potentially conflicting sides, respecting de facto realities of power, exchange such recognitions as their least costly strategy. History. Classical. The Roman jurist Ulpian observed that the imperium of the people is transferred to the emperor. The emperor is not bound by the law. The emperor's word is law. Emperor is the law-making and abiding force. Ulpian was expressing the idea that the emperor exercised a rather absolute form of sovereignty, although he did not use the term expressly. Medieval classical Ulpian's statements were known in medieval Europe, but sovereignty was an important concept in medieval times. Medieval monarchs were not sovereign, at least not strongly so, because they were constrained by unshared power with the feudal aristocracy. Furthermore, both were strongly constrained by custom. Sovereignty existed during the medieval period as the de jure rights of nobility and royalty, and in the de facto capability of individuals to make their own choices in life. Around c. 1380 to 1400, the issue of feminine sovereignty was addressed in Geoffrey Chaucer's Middle English collection of Canterbury Tales, specifically in The Wife of Bath's Tale, a later English Arthurian romance. The wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnall uses much of the same elements of The Wife of Bath's Tale, yet changes the setting to the court of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The story revolves around the knight Sir Gawain granting to Dame Ragnall, his new bride, what is purported to be wanted most by women: sovereignty. We desire most from men both land and poor, to have sovereignty without lies. For where we have sovereignty, all is ours, though a knight be ever so fierce, and ever win mastery. It is our desire to have master over such a sir. Such is our purpose. The wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnall. Reformation sovereignty re-emerged as a concept in the late 16th century. A time when civil wars had created a craving for stronger central authority, when monarchs had begun to gather power onto their own hands at the expense of the nobility, and the modern nation-state was emerging. Jean Bodin, partly in reaction to the chaos of the French wars of religion, presented theories of sovereignty calling for strong central authority in the form of absolute monarchy. In his 1576 treatise Les Six Livres de la République, Bodin argued that it is inherent in the nature of the state that sovereignty must be absolute. On this point he said that the sovereign must be hedged in with obligations and conditions, must be able to legislate without his subjects' consent, must not be bound by the laws of his predecessors, and could not, because it is illogical, be bound by his own laws. Perpetual, not temporarily delegated as to a strong leader in an emergency or to a state employee such as a magistrate. He held that sovereignty must be perpetual because anyone with the power to enforce a time limit on the governing power must be above the governing power, which would be impossible if the governing power is absolute. Bodin rejected the notion of transference of sovereignty from people to the ruler. Natural law and divine law confer upon the sovereign the right to rule, and the sovereign is not above divine law or natural law. He is above only positive law, that is, laws made by humans. The fact that the sovereign must obey divine and natural law imposes ethical constraints on him. Bodin also held that the lois royales, the fundamental laws of the French monarchy which regulated matters such as succession, are natural laws and are binding on the French sovereign. How divine and natural law could in practice be enforced on the sovereign is a problematic feature of Bodin's philosophy. Any person capable of enforcing them on him would be above him. Despite his commitment to absolutism, Bodin held some moderate opinions on how government should in practice be carried out. He held that although the sovereign is not obliged to, it is advisable for him, as a practical expedient, to convene a senate from whom he can obtain advice, to delegate some power to magistrates for the practical administration of the law, and to use the estates as a means of communicating with the people. With his doctrine that sovereignty is conferred by divine law, Bodin predefined the scope of the divine right of kings. Age of Enlightenment. During the Age of Enlightenment, the idea of sovereignty gained both legal and moral force as the main Western description of the meaning and power of a state. In particular, the social contract, as a mechanism for establishing sovereignty, was suggested and, by 1800, widely accepted, especially in the new United States and France, though also in Great Britain to a lesser extent. Thomas Hobbes, in Leviathan, borrowed Bodin's definition of sovereignty, which had just achieved legal status in the Peace of Westphalia, and explained its origin. He created the first modern version of the social contract theory, arguing that to overcome the nasty, brutish and short quality of life without the cooperation of other human beings, people must join in a commonwealth, and submit to a sovereign, power, that is able to compel them to act in the common good. This expediency argument attracted many of the early proponents of sovereignty. Hobbes strengthened the definition of sovereignty beyond either Westphalian or Bodin's by saying that it must be absolute, because conditions could only be imposed on a sovereign if there were some outside arbitrator to determine when he had violated them, in which case the sovereign would not be the final authority. Indivisible. The sovereign is the only final authority in his territory. He does not share final authority with any other entity. Hobbes held this to be true because otherwise there would be no way of resolving a disagreement between the multiple authorities. Hobbes' hypothesis, that the ruler's sovereignty is contracted to him by the people in return for his maintaining their physical safety, led him to conclude that if and when the ruler fails, the people recover their ability to protect themselves by forming a new contract. Hobbes's theories decisively shape the concept of sovereignty through the medium of social contract theories. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's definition of popular sovereignty provides that the people are the legitimate sovereign. Rousseau considered sovereignty to be inalienable. He condemned the distinction between the origin and the exercise of sovereignty, a distinction upon which constitutional monarchy or representative democracy is founded. John Locke and Montesquieu are also key figures in the unfolding of the concept of sovereignty. Their views differ with Rousseau and with Hobbes on this issue of alienability. The second book of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Du Contrat social, Aux Principes du droit politique, deals with sovereignty and its rights. Sovereignty, or the general will, is inalienable, for the will cannot be transmitted, it is indivisible. Since it is essentially general, it is infallible and always right, determined and limited in its power by the common interest, it acts through laws. Law is the decision of the general will in regard to some object of common interest. But though the general will is always right and desires only good, its judgment is not always enlightened, and consequently does not always see wherein the common good lies, hence the necessity of the legislator. But the legislator has, of himself, no authority, he is only a guide who drafts and proposes laws. But the people alone has authority to make and impose them. Rousseau, in his 1763 treatise of the social contract, argued, the growth of the state giving the trustees of public authority more and means to abuse their power, the more the government has to have force to contain the people, the more force the sovereign should have in turn in order to contain the government, with the understanding that the sovereign is a collective being of wonder, resulting from the general will of the people, and that what any man, whoever he may be, orders on his own, is not a law, and furthermore predicated on the assumption that the people have an unbiased means by which to ascertain the general will.